to Transformation in Trials. Welcome to Transformation in Trials. This is a podcast exploring all things transformational in clinical trials. Nothing is off limits on the show, and we will have guests from the whole spectrum of the clinical trials community. And we're your hosts, Ivana and Sam. Welcome to another episode of Transformation in Trials. Today we have our very first returning guest on the show, Brian D. Smith. We recorded episode 8 of season 1 with Brian talking about business models in pharma. And today will really be an extension of that conversation, but with a focus on his brand new book called New Drugs, Fair Prices. I'm so glad to have you in the studio, Brian.
Well, thank you for inviting me back. I'll take that as a big compliment that I'm the first returning guest.
Well, you should. And well, Brian, not all are, we have a lot of new listeners on the show since season 1. So maybe you could just give us an introduction of yourself for our new listeners.
Certainly. Well, I've been in the pharmaceutical and medical technology sectors, the life sciences sectors, for a very long time. I started in the industry as a research chemist over 40 years ago now. I spent many years in the labs, and then I transferred across to marketing and strategy. So altogether, I was in the industry in pharma and medtech for 20 years. But for the last 20 years or so, I've been a combination of academic, author, and advisor. So I work at 2 universities, Hertfordshire in the UK and Bocconi in Milan in Italy. And all of my work is related to research in pharmaceuticals and medical technology. I teach masters and research students how to do research, and I teach strategy modules about strategy in the industry. I'm also an external examiner at UCL in London. But all of my work is related to effectively strategy and business models and competitive strategy in the pharma and medtech sector. So that's what I do.
Yeah, and you take a very interesting approach to some of your books, at least. You take this Darwinian approach. And can you tell me more about what that is and why you're interested in looking at the world in that way?
I'm sure a lot of your listeners will be trained as scientists. And of course, what scientists are taught to do is they don't approach a problem or question or an issue as a blank. They come at it from a scientific perspective. So if you're an epidemiologist studying COVID, you probably come at it from a germ theory perspective about how viruses spread. If you work in the social determinants of health, you work you come at it from that perspective and so on. But it's interesting that historically, there hasn't really been a scientific approach to understanding how our industry is structured and how its business models are what they are. Because, although people talk about the pharma industry business model, there isn't one, of course. There isn't a single one. I mean, if I look at a Roche and I look at an Indian generics company, they're both pharmaceutical companies, but they're not one business model, are they? I use a theoretical perspective, a scientific perspective known as generalised Darwinism. And the principle of that is that the industry is a complex, adaptive ecosystem with lots of entities all interacting with each other, not just pharma companies, but regulators and governments and payers and so on. And they interact with each other and they adapt to each other. And that's the definition of a complex adaptive system. And the scientific theory that we have to explain the behavior of complex adaptive systems is Darwin's theory of evolution. Now, of course, we're all familiar with it from a biological point of view, but actually it explains the behavior of any complex adaptive system, whether that's the Amazonian rainforest or the pharmaceutical industry. And I use it to explain that. And in that context, business models are like species and pharmaceutical companies are like animals within a species. And the selection pressures are created by the sociological and technological environment and so on. So it's all a bit geeky, But it turns out to produce very useful, practically useful results about how you manage the evolution and the adaptation of your company in our changing environment. And it's a lot of fun. My wife tells me I'm not allowed to talk about it at dinner parties because it bores all our friends. but I enjoy it. He kicks me under the table and says, "No, don't talk about that."
And for me, it was really interesting reading through your book. Also because I am in the life sciences space, I am living the reality of this ecosystem that we have. And I feel like the way that you describe it in your book approximates reality rather well. But I'm curious, what was your motivation for writing this particular book?
Well, this book's it's a particularly important book to me, although, it's my 8th book. I've written 7 books before, but this one's particularly important to me. Partly because pharmaceutical innovation is very, very important. I mean, many of us are alive today because of pharmaceutical innovation. But also because it's what scientists call a wicked problem. There's a couple of theorists coined the phrase wicked problem. It's messy, it's difficult to solve, it doesn't lend itself to simple solutions. And we need to understand how to optimize pharmaceutical innovation. But as you're aware, all over the world, there's this argument going on about the cost of pharmaceutical innovation, because we're able to invent fantastic drugs. These days, advanced therapies like cell and gene therapies, at what we say in English are eye-watering prices. On $3 million to treat a patient, and so. As you'll be aware, there's a debate all over the world about the cost of pharmaceutical innovation, the prices, £3 million therapies. And we've seen a trend over the last couple of decades, from small molecules to biologics and primary care to specialty. And now we're seeing it towards advanced therapies. And in most countries, but especially in the US, there's developed this very heated debate about whether we should control drug prices or whether we should let them be free and so on. And it's a problem because it's quite often looked at simplistically as if pharmaceutical was a machine, like you could turn a lever or pull a handle and get, control prices or let prices go free and get more innovation or less innovation. And that worries me because it's far too simplistic a view of how pharmaceutical innovation works, with all of the complex interactions. I compare it in the book actually to the apothecary's garden. If we go back 300 years ago, the pharmaceutical business model was the apothecary, and the apothecary would keep a garden. And in that garden, he would grow herbs to make medicines. Well, actually, in reality, his wife kept the garden and he stood at the front of the shop.
Fun fact. Yeah.
And I mentioned that in the book. And obviously, what he was trying to do was get the maximum yield of the best herbs in a sustainable way. And it's no different from what we're trying to do today. What we want off the pharmaceutical innovation ecosystem to give us today is the drugs we want at the best possible prices, but in a sustainable way that keeps the innovation going. So I look at this argument, and there are extremists on both sides, who's and I look at them, and the metaphor I sometimes use when I'm explaining this to executives in the industry is it's a little bit like watching a couple arguing, a married couple arguing, and they're shouting at each other, but they're not listening. It's what the French have a phrase for this. The French say it's a dialogue of the deaf. And in a sense, the New Drugs, Fair Prices, the new book, is almost like an attempt at being a relationship counselor between those two arguing people. It's stop arguing about, who's taking out the rubbish or who was the last person who went with the dishwasher, or stop worrying about the details and look at the relationship, because we want to stay married, right? The pharmaceutical innovation, as we do it at the moment, cannot exist without the support of society. And society needs pharmaceutical innovation. So this couple need each other. And the book really is an attempt to look at the whole of the ecosystem and say, as if it was a garden, what do we need? How is it working? How isn't it working? How does it succeed? How does it fail? And what can we do to manage it so that over the long term, we get the drugs that we want at the prices the society can afford in a way that is sustainable? And that's essentially the inspiration for the book, as it were.
And do you feel like that is a problem that we're facing right now, that we are very polarized in this debate, and that is hindering the efficiency of drug innovation?
Well, I think that's true all over the world. I mean, all over the world, you will hear people saying that drug companies are charging too much, and you hear drug companies saying that we have to have profits to make innovation. But it's a particular problem in the US, and that's important, of course, because, like it or not, the US is the epicenter of both supply and demand of innovative pharmaceuticals. Pretty much any country in the world could disappear and pharmaceutical innovation would continue as it does now, with the exception of the US. So the book tends to focus to a degree on the situation in the US, but it has a lot of implications and resonances for outside of the US. And it's, I don't want this couple to break up. It would be a tragedy for both of them, for all of us, if it did. So this is an attempt to sort of look at the problem as a whole.
Yeah. And I have read multiple books about drug pricing from different perspectives. And I feel like your book offers a different perspective. Maybe you can share your own thinking on that.
Well, I've tried to. There are various books. If you listen to people in the space, either in books or Twitter or magazine or journal articles, take one view or the other. They say, they take the industry's view or they take society's view, and they pay relatively little attention to the needs of the other. So those books that have been written about from the pharmaceutical industry point of view, talk almost as if it's not a problem that the drug prices keep going up. Well, it's okay so long as they create value, and more or less pay insufficient attention to the problem that society may not be able to afford all of these things. And similarly, on the other side, those who criticize the industry heavily pay little attention to the fact that the capital, the money that funds R&D and can go anywhere. It could be invested in any industry. And if the pharmaceutical industry ceases to create a decent return on capital, then return on investment, then those investors will go elsewhere. So it's a little bit like talking to that married couple that I made the metaphor about, and saying you have to listen to each other. You have to understand that you both have needs.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's about bringing them together.
And that's what this book is trying to do. I've tried really hard to be balanced. I think one of the consequences of that is that people at either end of this argument will dislike the book. Each side, I'm sure, will look at it, see little pieces, see bits in it that they agree with, and say they are right, and they will see, and they will disagree with what they don't like. A little bit like, if you're trying to mediate between an arguing couple, they will try to bend your position to make them look right. But the book really is aimed at the intelligent thinking person in the middle who says, look, we have to fix this problem. How do you do this in a balanced, even, intelligent way?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's dive a little bit further into some of the main messages of your book. You start out with categorizing our industry as a whole, and then we dive deeper into some of the habitats. Maybe you could tell us more about that piece.
Sure. It's interesting. I mean, in the pharmaceutical innovation ecosystem, although mostly when people use that term, they're referring to pharmaceutical companies, it's much more than that. It's pharmaceutical companies and biotechs and university research labs and the NIH and other funding bodies and philanthropists, but also regulators and the US and the patent office and and monopolies commissions or fair trade commissions in the US, and patient groups, and in the US, insurers and payers, and insurers in other countries to different types of payers and distributors and channels. And it is a whole ecosystem, just as if you went in the Amazon rainforest, there were thousands of species. And all of them interact with each other to some degree or extent, but they don't interact evenly. It's not like everybody interacts with everybody else to an equal degree. They sort of cluster in their interactions into what I call habitats in the book, into 7 habitats. I refer to the discovery habitat, the innovation habitat, the coalition habitat, the patient habitat, the pricing habitat, the value habitat, and the competition habitat. And the interesting thing that an ecological perspective like that tells you is that for an ecosystem to work, which in our case means to deliver affordable, innovative drugs, all of those habitats have to work. They all have to contribute what is required to the overall ecosystem. And the way that ecosystems work, of course, is that if one habitat falls over, then the whole system falls over. You can't have a half-working habitat, a half-working ecosystem. You have to have all of these habitats interacting with each other and contributing to the whole ecosystem what it needs. So that's really the first finding, that these 7 habitats are there and they interact. And then in the main part of the book, I look at each of these 7 habitats in turn and discuss how well or how not well they are working. And then what we might need to do to make those habitats deliver what the ecosystem needs.
I'm wondering, when you were thinking through these 7 habitats, what kind of, how did you end up with these specific 7?
Well, it's interesting. I for the research process, obviously, you start with the literature review. And in this case, it was a particularly difficult one because it was really about 12 literature reviews, one on pharmaceutical pricing, one on drug discovery, one on drug development, one on patent and one on regulatory exclusivity regulation. And so you just, and that those literature reviews, apart from giving me an enormous headache, led to a series of questions about how the system works. And at that stage in the research, I had actually, as what I thought were 12 habitats. And then I went out and I realized that even though I'm very experienced in the industry, even though I know the industry quite well, after 40 years in it, I realized that I didn't know, I couldn't understand all of it. So I went out and I found 80 expert informants. So these were all people who are very knowledgeable about the industry, but they cover the complete spread from very basic research to patient groups and everything in between, patents, regulation, development, pricing, value assessment, everything you could think of. And I also deliberately, as well as picking them across the breadth of that whole value chain or ecosystem, I also picked people of varying views. So, I picked people who think the pharmaceutical industry are a bunch of villains who should be locked to jail. And I picked people who work for pharmaceutical companies who think that pharmaceutical companies are the saviors of the world. And in each of them, I essentially asked the question, how does this work? How can we make it work? And I gather, so that this is, 80 interviews. Each interview was at least an hour long. So, that's something like 5,000 or 6,000 words of interview transcript. So you do the maths, work out how much that is. Then I took those and I drew out the overlaps between that. Led to 10 what I call Delphi documents. So 10, if you like, thought documents summarizing the situation in different parts. So I'd gone from about 12 habitats to 10 habitats by then. And then I sent those back to those 80 people and said, or not all of them to everybody, but the one on regulatory, I sent all the people who knew about regulatory. The one on discovery, I sent all the people who knew about discovery. So each of those documents had about 8 or 10 people looking at it, who then came back to me and said, "Oh, you've got this bit right, Brian, but you've got that bit wrong. And oh, by the way, you've missed this piece." So that's called the Delphi process, where it reiterates like that. So it was a very laborious process. And as I did that, I realized that these 10 habitats I had were really 7 habitats.
It's also a very collaborative process where you get feedback on your thinking and you improve your thinking along the way.
And it was fantastic because, the people that I spoke to, and most of them are listed in the books. Some people prefer not to be named, but most of them are listed at the front of the book, were really the most knowledgeable people you could think of. The amount of knowledge of I think I calculated that on average the average 20 or 30 years experience in the industry, each of these people. So this is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of knowledge of the industry spread all across. And I did my best to sort of consolidate and pull all of that together. And obviously, I was adding my own knowledge and experience in all of the previous research I've done on the industry too. So it was an exhaustive and laborious process. It was about 2 or 3 PhDs worth of research. I joked with my colleagues, but we got there in the end, and I'm pleased with the results, because for each of those 7 habitats, we essentially say, well, what it is, what it needs to do in order for the ecosystem to deliver affordable innovation. What is, to what extent is it doing that? What is stopping it from doing what it's supposed to do? And what might we have to do to make it work properly so that we can get sustainable, affordable innovation? And that's the structure of each chapter, really.
Yeah, and I'm curious to dive further into that, because for each habitat, you also dive into some of the challenges that currently are in the habitat. Maybe we can just start with one of the early habitats, the discovery habitat. What kind of challenges do you see there?
Well, so the discovery habitat is a good one to give it both in its own right and as a way to give an example of the other chapters. So the job of the discovery habitat, of course, is to create new knowledge, which is then picked up and then turned into innovations. A lot of the critics of the industry say, well, the discovery habitats invents drugs, not the industry. That's not true. What comes out of the discovery habitat are scientific knowledge, scientific ideas, but it's not a drug. And even if it was, even when it is even when it's a molecule, we don't know how much to take, when to take, with what, it's not a usable drug. But it has to create new knowledge, but that new knowledge has to have a certain number of properties. Okay? Now, one of those properties, for example, is it has to be sufficient in quantity. It has to be relevant to the drugs that we need. And that knowledge has to be has to have a quality known as complementarity. So not just scientific knowledge about chemistry or biology, but also about the knowledge about the social conditions that lead to the condition and adherence to medication, for example. But one of the properties, if I just pick one of those, is an example of where that habitat is weak, is predictivity. That is, the knowledge that comes out of a university lab and goes into a biotech has to be translatable at relatively high efficiency into a drug. The results have to be replicable. The knowledge has to be usable. What worked in the model that they used in the university lab has to work in humans and so on. And it doesn't, well, quite often it doesn't. As anyone who works in drug discovery and innovation knows, for every 10,000 discoveries that are made, only one of them ever makes it to a drug. And now, if you think about that for a second, that means that the ecosystem is always going to be inefficient, because you're never going to get low cost or affordable drugs if you're inventing 10,000 discoveries for every one that makes it to the market. Now, to proceed down that line of thought, part of the reason for that is that our knowledge of translational science, the science that allows you to translate a discovery into a drug, is not as good as it should be. Now, there's an important distinction here I make in the book. It's not my distinction. It was a distinction of Christopher Austin, who used to head up MCATS, that part of the translational part of NIH. And he distinguished between translational research, which is where you have a discovery, let's say a drug target, okay, and you translate it into a drug. That's translational research. But translational science is about the more basic underlying science about what's the difference between a mouse model and a human model, for example. Now, he argues that, and I make this case in the book too, that if we understood translational science better, we would have a much better conversion rate, translation rate. But that translational science is like, have you heard the expression, the tragedy of the commons?
Yes, well, I have, from macroeconomics.
That's right. Well, it's everybody wants to use translational science, but nobody wants to pay for it. So what we tend to do is to spend lots more money on translational research, which is translating that discovery into that drug, and quite often failing because the underlying science is lacking. In the book, I make a metaphor with, if anybody's watching this in video, they'll be able to see my saxophone behind me. I compare it with my music lessons. So my saxophone teacher gets me to do two things in each lesson. One is learning a particular tune, but the other one is doing scales and so on. And in a sense, learning to play a particular tune is translational research. You get an output. But learning to play your scales is translational science. And you need to do both to be a good player. And in a sense, what the industry is doing is it's spending too much time on trying to play a tune and quite often failing, and not enough effort into learning scales. And Christopher Austin, in a fascinating paper, identified a whole load of areas of translational science that we could improve, and if we improve those, if we invested in those, that would improve productivity, that would make drug investment more, drug discovery more predictive, which would make innovation more cost effective and so on. So that's just an example, and I'm trying to take up the whole of the call with that. But in the discovery habitat, that and several other issues added up to making the discovery habitat not deliver what the ecosystem needs. And I can make similar arguments for the other six habitats where they're just not delivering what the ecosystem needs to function the way that we need it to function.
Yeah, there is I think a couple of places in the book you touch upon this point that there's a hierarchy of sciences, or maybe some snobbery associated with which science is best. And it sounds like what you're describing there is that we value one particular kind of science over other kinds of sciences. And that's one of the...
There is. I mean, if you look at the work that's... there's two cultural issues there where I talk about that. One is this bias towards biology, chemistry, physical, natural sciences, and the relative neglect of social and organizational sciences that are important. So, for example, we spend a lot of effort, quite rightly, on trying to understand the mechanism of a disease. Okay, but if I say to you, okay, so what is the mechanism? But when a drug comes to be developed, it is done by a network of biotech and university and subsidiary supporting companies and venture capitalists and so on. In the book, I call that a holobiont. That's a biological term. This network of entities that develop a drug. Now, where is the research about how a holobiont works? There is very little. And we could improve that process. So that was one of the areas, where we need better complementarity of knowledge. But the other cultural issue, of course, is there is still a cultural divide between research as it's done in discovery in university laboratories, who, of course, are driven by publication. Okay, in a sense, it doesn't really matter how predictive and practically useful your research is. They're driven very heavily by the need to get published. And they had that cultural hierarchy with a professor at the top and so on. And that's very different from what happens in a biotech. And some of the most interesting interviews I did were with people who had worked in both environments. And they talk about the cultural differences between one and the other and how that leads to difficulty in the translation process because it's like two different tribes talking to each other. And they were very, very interesting guys to talk to. I loved it because, it appealed very strongly to my scientific roots and having, one foot in academia and one foot in practice. And it was so clear that these cultural issues were affecting how well the translation process works. And yet almost nobody's done any research on that area.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, in the book, you also offer solutions to some of the problems that you also identify. Mm-hmm. I'm curious if you would share some of those.
Well, I spend the last third of each chapter talking about solutions. And the important thing about solutions, of course, is that if you accept the premise that this is a complex adaptive system, like a garden or like a rainforest, okay, you don't, and it's not, and it's ailing, it's not doing what it should do. You don't solve it with one solution. Okay, that's not the way it works. Human beings have been prone to doing that in the past with complex adaptive ecosystems and screwing things up because of it. So you're probably familiar with the Joni Mitchell song, Big Yellow Taxi, where she sings, leave me spots on the apples, but give me spots on my apples, but leave me the birds and the bees. Where in the late 50s and 60s, we started hitting agricultural crops with DDT. Well, gets rid of the problem, doesn't it? Gets rid of the spots on the apples, but it also kills the birds and the bees, right? And so that's an example of trying to solve a complex adaptive system with a single solution. But there are lots of other examples. So in nature, in the US, they had something called the Dust Bowl in the 1930s, where they destroyed a habitat with one single invention, which was the mechanized tractor. The Grand Banks fishery off the northeast coast of the United States and Canada collapsed because of an intervention. So I stress very much that anybody, if you hear anybody who says the answer is, then be very suspicious of that. There is no single answer to managing a complex adaptive ecosystem. I identify in the course of the 7 habitats 31 different problems with the various habitats, and they cascade through to 27 different things we need to do. And the important thing is that, like managing a garden or any ecosystem, we will have to do all of those 27. We can't cherry pick. We can't say, oh, that's the most important and that's the least important, because they're all interconnected and they all work together. But, if I go back to my couples metaphor, much like, if a couple are arguing, bringing a bunch of flowers will not solve the problem, right? You need a more comprehensive approach. So I talk about 27 different things. I'll give a couple of examples of those, and then I'll talk about how they group together. So, I talk about, for example, investing more money in translational science. I talk about increasing the power of payers in relation to intermediaries in the market. I talk about improving the sources and variety of funding in the venture capital space. I talked about improving the ways that we, not just introducing value-based pricing, but improving the methods by which we assess value of pharmaceuticals. I talk about how patents and regulatory exclusivity are not very, at the moment, they're not very good at discerning between innovations that are societally valuable and innovations which are not. And I talk about improving that. So 27 different things altogether, but they actually coalesce into 3 big projects, or moonshots, if you like. The first is about making the discovery innovation process more valuable. That is, so that what it develops is more of what we want and at lower cost. That's one. The second project is about assessing the value of pharmaceutical innovation more accurately, more accurately and more validly, with real-world validity. You'll be aware, of course, that most value assessments at the moment are made on very limited data that was generated for clinical reasons rather than health economic reasons. And the third of those three is about making the market work more like a real market, so that socially valuable innovation is encouraged and enabled, and imitation, that is biosimilars and generics, are enabled, so that we need a situation where innovation is appropriately rewarded, but not more than appropriately rewarded. And we need a situation where where imitation is enabled, but not before the innovators have made an appropriate return on investment. So the three big projects I identify in the book, and they all need to be done at once. They refer to different parts of the ecosystem. But I think what's interesting about those three projects is they're not industry projects, and they're not projects that can be done by the government. They're really societal projects. And we need to do it. I was asked at a recent meeting I held, when should we start this? And I was reminded of this quote by Confucius, I think it is, who said, the best time to plant a tree is 30 years ago. but the second best time is today. Yeah. And these things I try very hard in the book to not get too bogged down in the details of policy and so on. There just isn't space in a single book to do all of that for 27 different interventions. But I try to give guidelines about what would be a good intervention and what wouldn't be a good intervention. And I try to leave the detail of, for example, how you would redesign regulator exclusivity, I'll leave the detail to people that are more expert in that. Otherwise, the book would have been, the book's 300 pages long. It would have been 300,000 pages long otherwise. Yeah.
And you mentioned that you are the middle ground between two sometimes rather extremist camps. Mm. So I'm wondering, how has the response to your book been so far?
Well, it's interesting, as I went through the Delphi process and shared these ideas with, the more, that's not calling me the more passionate people on either side, okay, looked at the 27 things like, yes, we'd love that, we'd love that. So, for instance, people from the industry said, yes, we would love the government to spend more money on translational science. But we don't like the idea of the government negotiating on price more. And the people on the other side would say, we love the idea of the government negotiating on price more, but we don't think they should spend more money on research because the industry should do that. And I think that's a good lesson to learn from the book. If I go back to my arguing couple metaphor, it's like the husband saying, well, yes, I think the wife should change in these ways. And the wife saying, I think the husband should change in these ways, but I don't need to change, do I? So, and the truth is, both need to change on. In this case, lots of parts of the industry need to change. Pharmaceutical companies, governments, especially in the US, intermediaries like PBMs and insurers and so on, because there's a big issue there. Even if you made pharmaceutical innovation much less expensive and much more valuable, would that value reach the patient if the intermediaries are in the way capturing the value? And that's something I talk about in the book quite a lot.
Well, Brian, we always ask our guests the same question in all episodes, as you're very well aware. If I gave you a magic wand and you could wave it and change one thing about our industry, what would that be?
Yeah, well, I'm trying to answer that question in the context of this book. Okay. If I could change one thing, it would probably be related to how we create temporary monopolies in the industry. One of the deals of this contract between society and the pharmaceutical industry is essentially we agree to create to distort the market, to create temporary monopolies by some combination of patents and so on. And at the moment, that system either doesn't discern between levels of innovation, or if it does so in a very clumsy way, so we'll give incentives to biologics over small molecules, for example, even if that biologic is for frown lines and the small molecule is for something much more valuable. So I think if I could change one thing, I would change how discerning that is. But to go back to the premise of the book, even that wouldn't work. You have to do all of these things at once. It's a little bit like me, us saying to that couple, if you could change one thing, what would it be? And one of the partners saying, well, I would change this, but that wouldn't be enough. Yeah. It's a complex adaptive system. In my garden, when I look at my garden, I think what needs to be done right now is I need to cut back some of the hedges, but that wouldn't be enough. There's lots of things I need to do.
Absolutely. And Brian, where can people get a hold of your book, and where can they reach out to you with follow-up questions?
Well, they can get the book anywhere they would buy a book. They could get the book on Amazon is the obvious place. The publisher Routledge has it's on the routledge.com website. And I'll send you details of that to put in the show notes. The easiest way is just through my website, which I'll give is www.pragmatic.com, but I'm sure we'll put that in the notes, and they can get a sample chapter of the book from there if they want to. So it's very easy to get the book. Routledge do a really good job at making sure it is everywhere you could possibly get it. And if anybody wants to talk to me personally about it, and quite often at the moment, I'm going into quite a few pharmaceutical companies sharing the results about it, and signing books and talking to people about it. Then just get in touch with me through my email and my website, and I'll gladly do that.
Amazing. Well, it was
my baby. I love talking about it.
Well, it was amazing having you back on the show, Brian. Thank you so much for coming back.
Thanks for inviting me. It's always a pleasure talking to you, Ravonna. I'll come back and talk about one of my other books next time. See if I can be the first person to be on for the third time.
Well, let's aim for that.
Yes, let's do that.
You're listening to Transformation in Trials. If you have a suggestion for a guest for our show, reach out to Sam Parnell or Ivana Rosendahl on LinkedIn. You can find more episodes on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or in any other player. Remember to subscribe and get the episodes hot off the editor.